This is a presentation of OneLogin training.
Welcome to How to Get Started with OneLogin Workforce Identity, Part 4. All right, so once you've decided what options you want to apply to your user's login process, and perhaps need to create a few new policies for different sets of users, let's look at how these policies can be applied to the users. You can assign a user policy to an end user directly, or you can associate the policy with a OneLogin group and then assign the user to that group, either manually or automatically, which is much more exciting to be able to do. So first, let's take a look at manually assigning the user policy. Real quick option, just go to the user record, and from that user security policy dropdown, select the policy you want to apply to them. We've actually seen this a few times as we've been testing through this earlier in the course. The better process is to assign a user policy via a OneLogin group. Now each OneLogin group is associated with one user policy. Very important to understand, these OneLogin groups are different than any other group you might be used to. Users can only belong to one OneLogin group at any given time. Unlike Windows security groups, Office 365 groups, Google groups, or basically any other type of group I can think of, where users can belong to multiple groups. Here, users can only belong to one OneLogin group at any given time. Thus, only one user policy can be applied to a user at any given time as well. The groups can also be used as a management container, meaning you can grant someone admin rights over the users within a particular group. This means that a person would have the ability to create, update, or delete users within that group. You'll also see groups pop up as an option when you filter users, or if, say, you want to apply a bulk operation to a subset of your users. Most importantly, you can automatically assign your users to groups via what we call mappings, meaning you can assign users to groups based upon the fact that those users match certain criteria. How you design your groups is up to you and your organization's needs. You might have users in different geographic regions who have different security policies, or in different departments with different security policies, or maybe you want full-time employees handled differently than contractors. The key thing to remember is that for every custom user policy you create, you should create a group, associate the policy with the group, then assign the policy to your users via that group. The groups themselves are really easy to create. You can see them underneath your users menu, groups. Click on the new group menu button. That's it. Click on a button and give it a name. Then choose a policy to link to it. So let's go create a couple of groups. Let's go create our group. Easy peasy underneath users menu. Choose groups, click new groups. We'll do this, say, our engineers. We want them to have a little bit more security applied to them. Actually, we want them to be able to use the Smart MFA feature. There we go. So we'll just choose that Smart MFA policy that we created in our last example. We're going to apply it to our engineers and click Save. That's all we needed to do. Created our group. As far as assigning a user to a group manually, easy peasy. Go to the Authentication tab of the user. Choose the group from the drop down. Let's make sure we know how to do that. So manual process would be done from the user's record. Go find one of our users. Let's go play with Mr. Ransomware over here. Mr. Ransomware, we're going to go to his Authentication tab and choose from the group dropdown that new group, Engineers. Now, when I click Save over here, what's going to happen is it's going to change what we see underneath the user security policy. It says group policy is now Smart MFA, which was the user policy we associated with the Engineers group. Thus, we have signed the user policy via a group. But assigning it automatically is even better. So mappings are what we use to do some of the automation within OneLogin. Mappings are basically if-then statements. They're really nothing more than that. There's no if-then-else, no if-else-if-else. They're if this is true, then do this. The if portion is looking at user attributes within OneLogin. Their job title, the department, maybe values in custom fields, like if I add in a city field, what city they're in. If a user matches the conditions that are defined, if their attributes match those conditions, then the defined actions will be performed. And the actions basically are updating other user attributes within OneLogin, assigning them to a group, for example. Thus, a mapping looking at here a user's department field. And this one says, if the user department equals sales, then assign those users to a group that we've already created and called APAC sales. Thus, users that have their department field equals sales are automatically assigned to that group, and that group is associated with the APAC sales user policy. Thus, those users are now automatically assigned to the APAC sales user policy. It's one of the reasons why deciding how your users are created and ensuring that those user fields are populated with accurate information is incredibly important. Now, the mappings fire off automatically every time a user is created or updated within OneLogin. However, when you first create a mapping, or if you change an existing mapping, the mapping will not be automatically applied to all existing users. If you want that mapping to be applied, you have to manually apply the mappings. Thus, you need to perform the step you see here. Click on the Reapply All Mappings button. This is also an option underneath bulk operations, so you could do reapply all mappings to a subset of users if you wish. Or even go to an individual user record, and there's an Apply All Mappings option at the user level underneath the More Actions menu. So guess what? Let's go take a look at the auto magic. And my favorite automation, let's go to users. We're going to go create a mapping. So in this case, create a new mapping. We're going to say, oops, let's give it a name first because that's always helpful. So engineering group, we'll say. And anybody who is part of the engineering department, that'll work. We are going to set their group equal to that engineers group. That makes sense. Let's click save. Right now, again, not gonna happen. It's not going to apply this change to my users yet. Mappings only fire off when users are created or updated. Did either of those events just occur? No. What just happened was I created a mapping. So when I create mappings or I modify mappings, and again, I want those to apply to my existing users, I have to do this little manual step over here, reapply all mappings. And depending upon the number of users, number of mappings that I have, this can take quite a while. By the way, I actually don't have to apply it to everybody. I could just apply it to those who are in a particular group if I wanted to, but in this case, they're not even in the group yet, so I will have to say reapply all mappings. So I can go check out to see whether that completed or not, and I only have a few users, so it was really quite quick. So let's go check out one of the users that it should have been applied to, which in fact should be Mr. Spiro Fishing over here. And if I go to his authentication tab, we can see the group that he has been assigned to is engineers, and his group policy is Smart MFA. Now, what if I wanted to take him out of engineers, assign him to another group, or in this case, just take him out of the groups? Unfortunately, I can't do that because the mapping is going to fire off again. This, by virtue of the fact I've chosen a new option for him, is a change to him. It will fire off the mapping, and in fact, when we go back over to authentication, we'll see he's back in the engineers group. So he, fits the criteria. His department equals engineering over here. And no matter what, he's going to end up in that group, which is one reason, again, why this information, that user information, needs to be accurate and up to date. Or else we might have some settings that we really didn't want to go through. Now, if we do want to override at least what his user policy is, we can choose a different user policy from the user security policy dropdown. And that change will not be overridden by the mappings. In fact, it warns us. This will override any other policies. Okay. But if we do want it to be applied based upon the group that he's in, choose that group policy option. And again, at this point now, Smart MFA applies to my buddy over here, Spiro Fishing. Now that we have our user policies in place, let's take a look at another couple of features you can enable that can make it easier for your users to log in. First, we'll take a look at Windows Domain Authentication, previously known as Desktop SSO. Windows Domain Auth is often confused with OneLogin Desktop, basically because the end experience for the user is the same. A user logs into their workstation, and when they go to, say, the OneLogin portal, they are not prompted to provide a username and password. They might be prompted for MFA, but that will depend upon other configuration settings as well as whether MFA is part of their user policy. So first, let's understand what the difference is between OneLogin Desktop and Windows Domain Auth. So first line there is cost. OneLogin Desktop is an add-on. Costs extra per user. Windows Domain Auth is included. Also, OneLogin Desktop and its buddy Desktop Pro there's software that need to be installed on the user's machine. So users can download the software themselves and install it, or of course you could push it out through some sort of device management software. Windows Domain Auth does not cost anything extra again, nor does it need you to install any software. Simply some configuration changes that you need to make. Biggest difference though is Windows Domain Auth only works with machines that are joined to a domain with which OneLogin has a connection to through an Active Directory connector. Desktop Pro are not dependent upon Active Directory being around. So for those environments that aren't using Active Directory, Desktop or Desktop Pro will be the best answer. For those that are using Active Directory, you can take advantage of Windows Domain Auth. So Windows Domain Authentication works such that a user logs into their domain join workstation as they normally would. Then, when they browse to the OneLogin portal, OneLogin checks to see the IP address the request is coming from. So this would be like the public IP address of their machine. What do they get if they go to a browser and type in, what is my IP? So usually something that's configured through like NAT or whatever. But the public IP addresses, that's all OneLogin can really see. So if the public IP address the request is coming from is within a pre-configured range, that's part of what you need to do to set up Windows Domain Authentication, then OneLogin goes and through that Active Directory connector that it has set up with this Windows domain, goes to verify the user's integrated Windows authentication identity. That integrated Windows authenticated identity gets passed through the browser. The browser does need to be enabled to pass through that Windows identity. If the user is valid, then OneLogin simply lets them in. And again, the user will not be prompted to provide a username and password. Setting this all up, pretty simple. The Windows Domain Authentication form is underneath the Authentication menu. Simply check Enable and specify the IP address or IP addresses that OneLogin would be seeing coming from these Windows domain join systems. Then have a few options there as to whether you want to, honor the MFA that's in their user policy, include Macs or mobile devices that also might be part of the domain. But most importantly, at the bottom there, underneath authentication points, choose the Active Directory connector that's connecting to the domain that these users are coming from. If you have multiple forests, you might have multiple connectors. Again, a single connector can connect not only to a domain, but all the domains within its forest. But when you go beyond a forest, so you have multiple forests, you have to have multiple directory connectors. Only one of these directory connectors can handle the Windows Domain Authentication. So that means if you have multiple forests and you want to enable Windows Domain Authentication for all your users, then you would actually have to set up a two-way trust between those forests. And that is something that you would be configuring actually over on the Windows end. OneLogin Desktop then is the other option that you could enable, again, to make your user's login experience go just a little bit easier. When it comes to OneLogin Desktop, there are actually two versions of it. Sort of a basic version as well as a pro version. The difference between the basic and the pro version is mainly that with the basic version, users are logging into their local machine with local credentials. Then when they go to log into the portal, they get automatically logged into the portal, not having to provide their OneLogin credentials. With OneLogin Desktop Pro, they're logging into the local machine with their actual OneLogin credentials. So again, makes life really easy for the users. A single set of credentials, i.e. the OneLogin credentials that they need in order not only to get into their desktop, but to get into OneLogin, and of course, every application that OneLogin is providing single sign-on for. So the login flow with the basic version is the user logs into their workstation with their local credentials. They then browse, say, to the OneLogin portal. OneLogin checks to make sure that this is a valid request by checking the certificate. So OneLogin Desktop is really using certificates as an authentication factor. This also means that all systems that have OneLogin Desktop installed on them are considered to be trusted devices. If, of course, the cert is valid, then the user is going to be automatically granted access to portal without having to provide username and password. Whether they have to provide MFA or not, again, depends upon some other configuration settings. Pro, same basic flow. User logs into their desktop, but this time, again, the difference is the user's logging in with their OneLogin credentials. Then they go to the browser, or go to the portal checks to see they have the right cert. They've got the cert, they're logged on in. So it's only that first step that's slightly different depending upon whether they have OneLogin Desktop or OneLogin Desktop Pro. Installation is quite easy. Users can install it from their profile, or again, you can push it out using device management software. Once it installs, they'll see it in their taskbar, pop up on it. They can log out through there, generate new certs. Again, some other information they might find through the taskbar icon. Now, it is important, again, OneLogin Desktop is installing a certificate. So OneLogin Desktop could technically only be used if you want to require users to log in from a trusted device. So they can use OneLogin Desktop then to basically push out the cert to everybody and thus make their systems trusted devices. If you want the users to have the functionality I have just described, where then when they go to the OneLogin portal, they get automatically logged in, you do need to check the checkbox on the user policies sign-in tab. So you need to go to the user policies for these users that are using OneLogin Desktop, go to the sign-in tab, and check that bottom checkbox that we're seeing there. Don't require browse and login for trusted devices. By checking that checkbox, you're going to ensure that the functionality I've just described, where the users automatically get logged into OneLogin portal without providing a username and password, that feature will actually work. If that checkbox is not checked, that feature won't work. And then basically we are relying upon OneLogin Desktop to provide a certificate, and we have set up the user policy to require that they log in from a trusted device. So we're using OneLogin Desktop for a very different reason than what we were initially describing, which is making their lives a little bit easier when they're logging in. Up to you. But do know that difference, and do need to know that if you want the functionality I just described, check the checkbox at the bottom. All right, again, important to ensure that your users can easily and securely log to OneLogin before you continue on, since our next step is to configure connections to applications and, in many cases, change configuration settings so that users have to log in to OneLogin first before they can access those applications. You don't want to do this, then your users might not be able to log into those applications at all. And that's going to make for some very unhappy users. This concludes part 4 of how to get started with OneLogin Workforce Identity. Please continue on to part 5.
This is a presentation of OneLogin Training.